Miami, Hard Rock Stadium, July 3rd, 2026. A phone camera is rolling, not from the broadcast booth, from the stands. A black streamer in a Cape Verde jersey caught up in the noise of a World Cup crowd. Then a voice behind him, low, almost slipping past unnoticed. 3 words in Spanish: go cry at the zoo. That clip hit social media within the hour. By morning, FIFA has opened an investigation. Millions have watched it. And in the flood of outrage, almost nobody asks the real question. Why does this keep happening? And why does it keep happening around this specific country? Here's what most people don't know walking in. That moment in the stands wasn't an isolated slip from one angry fan. It was the surface of something buried on purpose over a century ago by a government that put it in writing.
Argentina didn't become known as one of the whitest nations in Latin America by accident. Someone engineered that. And to understand how, we need to talk about a president, a policy, and hundreds of thousands of people who, officially, just disappeared. So here's where the story actually begins. Not in a stadium, not in 2026, but in the early 1800s, in a city that doesn't look anything like the Buenos Aires you'd recognize today. Walk through the streets of Buenos Aires in 1810, and by some estimates, 1 out of every 3 people you pass is black or of African descent. Whole neighborhoods built around candombe drumming circles. Enslaved Africans, freed Africans, their children, folding themselves into the sound and rhythm of a city that hadn't yet decided what it wanted to be.
Even the word tango, that instrument you picture the second someone says Argentina, has African roots buried inside it. The country the world sees now was built in part by the very people it later tried to write out. Now, fast forward to 1887, same city. A census is taken, and the number of people counted as black has collapsed to under 2%. Not declined, collapsed. So the question becomes obvious. Where did they go? The official story for over a century has been a shrug. War, disease, assimilation. And to be fair, those things are real, and they did real damage.
Thousands of black men were pushed into Argentina's war against Paraguay in the 1860s, sent to the front lines at rates wildly out of proportion to their numbers. Then, in 1871, yellow fever tore through Buenos Aires, and it hit hardest in the poorest, most crowded neighborhoods, which is exactly where the black population had been pushed. But here's the layer most people never get to. None of that fully explains a drop that steep. A population doesn't fall from 1/3 of a city to under 2% just from a war and a disease outbreak, no matter how brutal. Historians who've spent decades on this, actual researchers, not internet theorists, point to something else running underneath it. Something more deliberate. A policy, a plan, and a president who believed openly that Argentina's future depended on making black Argentina disappear.
His name was Domingo Faustino Sarmiento. If you've never heard of him, that's fine. Most people outside Argentina haven't. But inside the country, he's not some obscure historical footnote. He's on the currency. Streets are named after him. Schools carry his name. He served as president from 1868 to 1874, and long before that, he was already one of the most influential intellectuals in Latin America. And Sarmiento had a theory. He split the world into 2 categories, civilization and barbarism. Civilization meant Europe, its cities, its whiteness, its idea of progress. Barbarism meant everything he saw as holding Argentina back, the countryside, indigenous communities, and explicitly black Argentina. He wrote about this, not in code, not in dog whistles. He wrote it in essays, in letters, in policy documents, with the confidence of a man who believed history would thank him for it. So what do you do if you believe your black population is standing in the way of progress?
You don't necessarily need violence as your main tool. You need numbers. Sarmiento and the intellectuals around him push something that sounds almost administrative out loud: mass European immigration, subsidized by the state, specifically to reshape who the average Argentine looked like. Millions of Italians and Spaniards arrived over the following decades. Argentina absorbed the largest wave of European immigration anywhere in the Americas outside the United States. But immigration alone doesn't erase a population. That took something quieter. Somewhere along the way, the census itself changed. The category black started disappearing from official forms, replaced with vaguer labels. People who would have been counted as black a generation earlier were suddenly filed as something else entirely. Not because they left, because someone redrew the box they had to check. That's the part that should sit with you for a second. You don't need to burn down a neighborhood to erase a people.
Sometimes all it takes is deciding, on paper, that they no longer fit the category. So the box got redrawn. And once you redraw it long enough, across enough generations, something strange happens. The myth doesn't just survive, it becomes the water everyone's swimming in. Ask most Argentines today whether their country ever had a significant black population, and a lot of them will tell you no. Not out of malice, out of genuine, sincere belief. They were never taught otherwise. Their grandparents weren't taught otherwise. There's even a former president of Argentina, Carlos Menem, who once said publicly that black people simply don't exist in his country, that it's a Brazilian problem, not an Argentine one. A sitting head of state saying the quiet part out loud more than a century after Sarmiento's policies had already done their work. And that belief didn't stay locked in a textbook. It became identity. Ask people across Latin America how Argentina sees itself, and you'll hear some version of the same thing.
That Argentines consider themselves a little more European than the rest of the continent, a little more civilized, in Sarmiento's own word. Buenos Aires gets called the Paris of South America. The architecture, the accent, the food, even the way the country talks about itself in global conversations, all of it leaning hard into a European identity. In a country that sits geographically, unmistakably, in Latin America. You can hear it every time Argentina plays Brazil. That rivalry isn't just about trophies. It gets dressed up as something else entirely. Sophistication versus chaos. Old world elegance versus a neighbor a lot of Argentines quietly consider too Latin American in the way they define the term. That framing didn't come from nowhere. It's the direct inheritance of a project that started with a president deciding on paper who counted and who didn't. Now hold that thought, because this is where it starts connecting to the thing you actually came here for, the game itself. A national identity built this deliberately doesn't stay in the history books. It shows up in the stands. It shows up in the chants. It shows up wearing the jersey. July 2024, Argentina has just won the Copa America. Best team in the world, trophy in hand, the whole squad buzzing with the kind of joy you only get after a final. Enzo Fernandez, one of the team's brightest young stars, pulls out his phone on the team bus and starts streaming. Teammates around him, still in their kits, riding the high. And then they start singing. It's not the anthem, it's a chant. One that had been floating around Argentine fan culture since the 2022 World Cup final against France. It targets French players by name, several of them black, mocking their family heritage in language that crosses straight from mocking into something uglier. Fernandez posts it himself, doesn't think twice. Within hours, it's everywhere. Wesley Fofana, his own club teammate at Chelsea, a black Frenchman, reposts the clip with 3 words: uninhibited racism. France's Football Federation files an official complaint. FIFA opens an investigation. Fernandez, to his credit, apologizes fast and directly, says the words don't reflect who he is. But here's the detail that matters more than the apology. Nobody on that bus stopped him. A whole team, mid-celebration, joined in without hesitation. And Lionel Messi, captain, global icon, the most famous face in the sport, never publicly said a word about it. Officials back home called on him to apologize. He didn't. Silence from the top of the pyramid is its own kind of answer. And this wasn't a one-off. FIFA has fined Argentina's federation multiple times over the years for discriminatory chanting from fans, homophobic songs during World Cup qualifiers years earlier, and then in June 2025, a fine of over 100,000 Swiss francs for racist abuse directed at fans from a visiting country. Different tournaments, different targets, same pattern, repeating itself in stadium after stadium, like something baked into the culture nobody's bothered to sand down. Which brings us back to Miami. July 3rd, 2026, round of 32. Argentina up against Cape Verde, a tiny island nation off the coast of West Africa, playing in its first ever World Cup, riding one of the most emotional underdog runs of the entire tournament. In the stands, wearing a Cape Verde jersey out of respect for that story, is a streamer with tens of millions of followers. And a few seats away, an Argentina fan leans in and tells him to go cry at the zoo. Same script, 150 years apart. Different decade, different technology, same instinct.
treat a black man as something less than a person, casually, in public, certain there'd be no real consequence. Except this time, there's a difference. This time, it's on camera, live, in front of millions of people watching in real time. FIFA responds within a day.
And something else happens too. Something that didn't happen in 1887 or even in 2024. The internet starts digging. Within 48 hours, clips explaining Sarmiento, Blanqueamiento, the whole buried history you just heard, are circulating with millions of views. People who'd never once questioned the idea that Argentina was simply naturally a white country are suddenly asking why. There's an elderly black activist in Argentina who spent decades speaking about exactly this. Asked about all the sudden attention, he said something that stuck with me. What's improved, he said, is visibility. Before, people insisted there was nothing to see. Now, at least it's visible. Things are better. But there's still a long way to go. That's not a victory lap. That's a man who's been fighting this fight since long before it was trending, telling you honestly where things actually stand. Argentina won that match, 3-2. Cape Verde's fairy tale run ended in the round of 32, the way debutante stories usually do. But the moment that's still being talked about isn't the scoreline. It's 3 words, said to a man in the stands that cracked open 150 years of silence. And that's exactly where this gets uncomfortable, and exactly where we need to keep going.
If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to hit subscribe and stick around. We put out stories like this one every single day, the ones nobody else is really telling about this sport. And I genuinely like to know, had you ever heard the word Blanqueamiento before today? Drop it in the comments. I read every one. Okay, back to it, because there's one detail in all of this I haven't told you yet, and it's the one that gets me every time I think about it. Cape Verde, the team that streamer was in the stadium supporting, has its own direct line to this exact story. For over 300 years, the islands of Cape Verde were one of the busiest hubs of the transatlantic slave trade on the entire planet. Ships loaded and unloaded human beings off that coastline for generations before a single one of those people ever set foot in Argentina or Brazil or anywhere else in the Americas. Cape Verde isn't some random opponent in this story. It's practically the source.
So when a fan in an Argentina jersey tells a black man to go cry at the zoo during a match against Cape Verde specifically, the irony isn't subtle. It's the exact same map, closing the exact same loop a century and a half later. The ships left from one side of that story, the myth got built on the other. And in July 2026, both ends of that history sat in the same stadium, at the same time, watching the same match. And that's what gets lost in the noise of a tournament like this one. Kickoffs, brackets, penalty shootouts. Football sells itself as the one language everybody already speaks. The one place where none of that older history is supposed to matter. 90 minutes, a ball, 11 versus 11, nothing else. But a chant on a team bus, a comment 3 seats behind a streamer in the stands, those aren't glitches in the game. They're reminders that the game doesn't erase what a country carries into it. It just hands that history a stage, a stadium, and a camera that's already rolling.
There's a phrase that kept surfacing while I was researching this one. Historians studying Argentina's black population don't usually call it decline or assimilation. They call it disappearance, as if a third of a city's population can just leave the room. But populations don't disappear. People disappear. One policy, one census, one generation at a time, until the ones left standing forget there was ever anyone else in the room to begin with. For 150 years, that erasure held. Nobody had to defend it, because almost nobody was left standing to argue against it. And then, on a July night in Miami, in front of a phone camera nobody expected to matter, 3 words slipped out of somebody's mouth without a second thought.
Go cry at the zoo. And the room, it turns out, was never as empty as everybody assumed. Cape Verde's players went home in the round of 32. Argentina kept marching toward the trophy, the way Argentina usually does. And somewhere in between those two facts, millions of people spent a week learning the name Domingo Sarmiento for the first time. Not from a textbook, not from a classroom,
but from a comment section underneath a World Cup highlight. That elderly man in Buenos Aires said it best. What's improved is visibility. Not the ending, not the fix, just visibility. Which means the story you just watched isn't over. It's not even close to over. It's just, for the first time in a long time, being said out loud. If this one landed with you, hit subscribe and send it to 3 people who love this sport as much as you do. Stories like this one don't travel on their own. They need somebody to carry them. Drop a comment below. Honestly, whatever's actually sitting with you after watching this. And tell me, what's the next story buried inside this World Cup that you want me to go dig up? I'll see you in the next one.